Hi, everyone. This is Kim Wehle, Simple Politics. My guest today is Samuel Goldman, professor of political science at GW University here in Washington, D.C., and also a correspondent for The Week. And he's here today to talk about his, I think, very interesting recent piece called The Myth of Civic Education. Professor Goldman, thank you for coming on Simple Politics.
Thank you for having me, Kim.
So the first question I want to ask you, and this seems probably super basic, I'm sure, to even many listeners, but I've found that we can't be too make assumptions about shared definitions. And so my question is, what is civic literacy in your view?
Well, as you know, it's a broad and flexible term, which can include everything from factual knowledge of how a bill becomes a law to more practical and experiential knowledge of how to write a letter to an elected representative or how to otherwise lobby or pursue an interest. What I focus on in the piece is what's sometimes called textbook civics. How many branches of government are there? How long is the term of a member of the House of Representatives or the Senate? The kind of thing that people are often taught in courses that are called civics or government, usually in high school, but sometimes earlier and sometimes later.
So what was interesting to me, what caught my attention is this argument you make that the notion of enhanced civic literacy is misguided potentially, and we can break that down a bit. But I want to start by getting your thoughts on the politicization of civic literacy right now. That is, we're hearing these debates amongst politicians as to whether the history of enslaved populations in America, what some people call critical race theory, which is sort of taken from legal scholarly text, that is somehow anti-white or makes white students feel bad about themselves. I saw a clip from a public school in Texas in which an administrator was encouraging their faculty to teach the other side of the Holocaust. Is civic education hopelessly political, or is there a way that it can be taught well?
Well, I think the topic is inherently political, and that's clear if you look at the history of civic education, really extending back to the 1840s and the origin of what was called the Common Schools movement, which was an attempt to establish free public schools around the country that would have a more or less standardized curriculum. This was already the practice in much of New England, but was not common elsewhere. And the Common Schools movement, led by figures like Horace Mann, tried to nationalize that practice. And that had explicitly political goals. The leaders of the school reform movement were mostly old stock Protestants who were concerned that immigrants, at that time largely Irish Catholics and Germans who were sometimes Catholic and sometimes Protestant, were not assimilating to American life and were not prepared to participate in Republican self government. And the idea was, then as now, that by providing the right kind of classroom instruction, children would cultivate the knowledge and skills that they would need as citizens. Now, of course, what knowledge and skills that includes was controversial even then. And although we like to think that we are more polarized today than we've ever been in the past, I don't think that's really true. So in the 1840s, there were major riots in Philadelphia and other cities revolving around the question of whether excerpts from the King James or authorized version of the Bible should be used in public school. Protestant educational theorists thought this was important for learning the American way of speaking English and an American understanding of religious freedom. Many of the pupils and their families, particularly Catholics, saw it as an attempt to impose a specific religious vision on them. And this led to days of street fighting. So one of the tensions here is that we all want to believe that there is some neutral and widely accepted way to teach these things. But it turns out that there's much less agreement than meets the eye.
So you quote in your piece to the state of Oklahoma and the state of Florida. And my understanding, state of Oklahoma, there was a high school citizenship test imposed, and the goal, according to the article that you linked to, was to avoid rioting and looting by making sure high schoolers have basic civic education, 100 questions. They had to answer 60 of them correctly. A required study as well of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation. And what surprised me about it is Democrats opposed that. And then in Florida, you cite to an article that has Ron DeSantis, who's of course an anti-vaxxer, anti-COVID, quite sort of controversial, far right wing, pro Trump conservative right now in America, who is authorized $106 million for a civic literacy initiative in Florida. I didn't have the time to dig into what was in it, and actually wasn't in the link. Where did, in your view, do the political battlegrounds sort of fall out today? Because it seems to me that civic education is something progressives would normally get behind, and it doesn't look like that happened in Oklahoma.
Well, I think that many progressives regard what's sometimes called critical race theory or diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives as a form of civic education. As they see it, it's a way to learn about the true past of the country and how different groups of people can learn to get along. Conservatives, of course, don't agree. They see that as an attempt to impose a very specific, ideologically charged understanding of virtue and equality, which they don't share. And I think that the initiatives that you mentioned in Oklahoma and Florida are a response to that. In effect, conservatives and Republicans say, well, they're going to try to push their brand of civic education down our throats. We are going to respond and use the power we wield in state legislatures and as governors to impose a version of civic literacy that is more consistent with our beliefs.
And so you mentioned inconsistent with our beliefs. And I'm not a scholar of critical race theory, but of course, as you know, as a member of the academy in your area, academics come up with fancy words oftentimes to describe common sense human behavior. And I don't know a lot about critical race theory, but I think there's an argument that it's just a version of history. That is, we have a history of discrimination and 400 years of enslaved populations that happen to be black and brown in America. So, is there when you talk about for your own courses the great books, and mentioned Oklahoma, studying the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, Emancipation Proclamation, are there basic historical facts that people can agree on in basic texts, or does all of it sort of dissolve into politics? Because I think that's, frankly, Sam, that's just sad to me.
Well, there are certain historical facts in the most basic sense of events happening at certain times. I mean, as far as I know, nobody disputes that independence was proclaimed in 1776 or Abraham Lincoln took office in 1861. Those are facts that are not disputed. What is disputed is the meaning of those facts. And the term critical race theory is probably not appropriate. As you mentioned, it's an academic approach that emanated from law schools and has developed and ramified through other disciplines. But it's a term people use to describe a set of assumptions, including the claim that racism is pervasive, that there has been no significant progress in civic or social equality, and finally, that any statistical disparity in outcome is prima facie evidence of racism. And that's what people are really objecting to when they object to what they call critical race theory, whether that's strictly speaking the correct term or not. The alternative that's been promoted in Oklahoma, in Florida, and in other states is a version of what in my book, After Nationalism, I call creedal Americanism, the idea that there are certain underlying values that define the United States. And of course, we have not always observed those values with perfect fidelity. But what's important for students is to recognize and affirm at least the attempt to live up to that standard. And the reason that I think these controversies become so bitter is that one side sees the standard as at best hypocritical and at worst a lie, and the other sees it as the object of well intentioned, if imperfect, aspiration.
Which standard are you referring to?
The idea, the standard proclaimed in the Declaration and other
Mm.
texts that we are created equal, that we are entitled to equal rights and freedoms, and that any failure to realize those principles is a deviation from the American project rather than its truth.
So equality would be one of those foundational values, right? So there should be, I mean, it seems to me there would be some overlap between these two poles. That is, equality based on whatever characteristic seems to be some human value. Take
Yes.
race, for example. I think we could agree, hopefully, as a country, that humans shouldn't own other humans. That
Yeah,
there
I
are
mean, I think that's not particularly controversial, although of course it is controversial how we should judge our predecessors.
So
Many
it's
of
more
whom
it's more
did
the
participate
it's the
in slavery.
analysis of the facts, less so than the facts. Although when I hear
Right.
something like the other side of the Holocaust, it's really hard to wrap my mind around something like that. If you think of it as sides rather than the factual pretext, for example, that's a
Right.
bit
Well,
troubling.
it's a matter of the moral significance of these facts. So nobody really disputes, to mention another issue that I recently wrote about, that Thomas Jefferson, over the course of his life, owned more than 600 people. That is an undisputed fact. The question is what to make of that. So in some people's view, that utterly disqualifies him from civic honor. And for that reason, his statue is being removed from the city council chambers in New York. In others' view, including my own, although that is an important thing to know about him, it does not outweigh or exclude his achievements, which include the expression of an argument that can be and was used to condemn the practice of slavery. So once again, and this gets at my skepticism about the importance of civic education, it's not so much that we are arguing about the facts as that we have different views of what the facts mean.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of agree, but it seems a little aspirational, frankly, to me, because it seems like we are, in some way, disagreeing about the facts. In that, just to go back to the basics, right? So you're a university educator, I'm a university educator. So we do have these kinds of theoretical debates. We might talk about critical race theory or other lenses of understanding history. My experience, even teaching law school, is that the sort of basic bread and butter understanding of not just civics, but history, language, vocabulary, sentence structure, um, critical thinking skills seems to become more and more scarce with as the years go by. And so I'm just pulling up from, I mean, maybe this isn't, I don't know, entirely, I don't know how authoritative the source is. The American Council of Trustees and Alumni National Survey did 26% of respondents thought Brett Kavanaugh was the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. 14% thought Antonin Scalia, who died in 2016. 18% identified Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's a freshman, or obviously a young member of Congress, as the author of the New Deal rather than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So when we're, and of course these are all Kavanaugh and AOC, very controversial political figures in this moment. To me, it seems that there is maybe something about basic facts. And is that, and are we saying that that is not the piece that you object with the civic education? Do you agree there should be more of that taught earlier, or no?
I'm not sure how effective that is. And one of the
Hmm.
things that I discuss in the piece is that, contrary to what's often assumed, there's very little evidence that there is less civic knowledge today than in the past. We have systematic studies of these issues going back at least to the late 40s, and they show very similar patterns of ignorance about basic institutions of government or public figures of the time. So I don't think that the situation is really getting worse. And because there's no evidence or very little evidence that people are more ignorant of these matters now than they would be in the past, than they were in the past, I'm also skeptical that that is the reason for increased polarization one way or the other. Um, in the past, when civic participation was a great deal higher and there was not perfect consensus, of course, because there never is, but a more broadly shared civic ethos than today, people didn't know any more than they do now.
So
So
you,
I
so
think that
yeah.
many of these efforts are based on the assumption that if people knew more answers to these kinds of trivia questions, there would be more fundamental agreement. I just doubt that that's the case.
Well, trivia questions that is grounded in some kind of basic historical fact, right? Which is the basis for talking about the various lenses or the moral judgments to draw that. Is that what you mean by trivia questions, or?
Well, I mean the kinds of questions that can be tested as a matter of civic knowledge. Who is a certain public figure? How many branches of government are there? How long does a member of the Senate serve? The truth is, Americans have never known very much about these things. And
Right.
since
Mhm, go ahead.
our civic health has varied over time, well, ignorance seems to be constant. It's probably not the ignorance that's causing the variation.
Got it. I think that makes sense. I mean, you do mention that education leads to civic engagement in your piece, but not necessarily in by teaching civics in classrooms. That it's mainly higher education, graduate or college education, and that if we do it in the classroom, we can't do it well. Which I agree with that in part. That is the discussion about critical race theory in the classroom for a fourth grader or even an eighth grader or an 11th grader is so higher level. I wish they kind of had that level of engagement on lots of different subjects. But my question then is, you know, and maybe what struck me about your piece was I'm one of the ones that probably was lured into some sense that civic education is a good thing. I've written a couple books, and the books are one's on the Constitution, one's on voting, and they're designed not so much to teach content or what you say trivia facts, Wikipedia pages, but to sort of explain the machinery of government, the cause and effect of government, the why it works the way it works, and to relate it to your own life. That is, that you need consequences for broken rules, including under the Constitution, or the rules are meaningless. And we know that if there's a speed limit, that there's no tickets, you're going to keep speeding. Those kind of common sense notions that I find when I say do a C-SPAN interview with people calling from independent, Democrat, Republican, just these baked in notions that defy common sense. Do you think, and you talk about in your piece framing it, reframing it, do you think there's a way to teach teachers how to talk about these things better? And I mean, having taught a lot, I'm sure you have pedagogical ideas about how to do it in a way that's not indoctrination,
Mhm.
but is skills based, is analytical skills based.
Well, one of the things that I suggest in the piece is to get rid of the concept of civics or government, because as soon as you tell people that something is good for them and they're going to learn useful skills, they stop paying attention. I've certainly found this to be true of students, and I know it to be true of myself. So many of these topics really are interesting and important. I think they would probably be much more effective reintegrated into the rest of the curriculum through traditional subjects like history and English and so on, rather than taught in this separate, well, now it's time to eat your vegetables sense. And I think those efforts really are well intentioned, because people respond to exactly the kinds of experiences you've described and say, well, we need to teach people how to be better citizens. But once again, there's really not a lot of evidence that doing that in a classroom setting, especially with the clear implication that it's going to be for your own good,
Mm-hmm.
actually affects civic behavior or results in people acquiring and retaining much knowledge over time.
Do you agree that civic engagement is a public good? That is, it's good if people vote, or is that also something that maybe it's just not aspirationally sound?
On the whole, I think it's a good thing if people vote, but it's only good if people vote if they vote in an organized and informed way. And this used to be accomplished very differently at earlier periods of American history when people spent much less time in school. And this is another thing that I emphasize in the column. We have this image of engaged citizenship in the past. It can't be because people took better classes in school, because they simply weren't in school. And in fact, until the 1970s, believe it or not, the median American had an eighth grade education. So nothing they learned in high school mattered, because they did not attend high school. Rather, they participated in a much wider and more lively range of civic associations, labor unions, various local interest groups, local government, religious communities, and so on, that provided a context and way of practicing civic skills that was not about reading a textbook and taking tests. And I think that's really what we're missing, not so much formal classroom instruction, but informal civic practice conducted not only a few hours a day for a few years of people's lives, but throughout their whole lives. And that was really what helped to organize people and help them to channel their political behavior, not that they were reading books and articles and reflecting in a more sophisticated and informed way than people do now.
Or watching Schoolhouse Rock in the 1970s, I must confess. That did come up on, I might have been like an SAT that I could state the preamble to the Constitution. So I'm going to put a plug in for that. Well, this is fascinating because, so I'm going to follow up and ask you, what happened in your mind historically to our culture, setting aside civic education, that people aren't doing that anymore?
Well, one of the most important developments, really, of the last century and more has been the erosion of political parties as practically integrated organizations that call on rank and file members to do stuff rather than simply to cast a ballot every year or 2 years or 4 years. Um, and the motives for some of the legal and regulatory changes that led to this result were good. The political parties were notoriously subject to corruption. And by mid century, particularly in the Democratic Party, party institutions were being used to uphold racial segregation in effect, and were the target of progressive reformers. But the result has been to hollow out the parties and to deprive ordinary people of one of their primary points of contact with the political process and with civic institutions. Now, of course, we have a high degree of party identification. It's very important to people, maybe more important than ever, that they call themselves Democrats or Republicans. but they're not actually connected to a party institution that requires them to do anything or to work with anyone else. So
So
that
take us back to 1962 or something. What did that look
we'd
like?
have to go, we'd have to go farther
Further
back
back. Okay,
than
so let's
1962.
take a snapshot of that connection for people, particularly young people that weren't born then. What is the once upon a time story that you're depicting of an America where there was more engagement through party institutions and therefore more civic engagement that had nothing to do with formal education, but was a common good in that people participated
Right.
more in their
Well,
political process?
whether it's a common good or not, I leave to listeners to decide because it's not a pretty picture. This is a time when there are far fewer official social services. So if you want something from the government, if you want a job, if you want some food, if you want some other kind of help, you have to go to your local party boss. And your local party boss says, okay, I will help you with your needs, but you need to help me. And
And
what you
what year are we in, Sam?
call it 1900.
Okay.
You need to help me, and here's what I need you to do to help me. Yes, you go out and vote, but I need you to find 5 friends and make sure that they all vote the right way. And maybe they find their friends and make sure that they all vote the right way. And the party organizations were, in effect, the central civic institutions of many parts of the American landscape, particularly in cities. These are the infamous political machines. And through those encounters, people develop a working sense of politics as something they know how to do and something they are organized to do. In some cases, just by showing up and voting. But in other cases, people really become engaged and active citizens and rise within the party and go on to discharge other influential roles. All of this is outside the formal party structure. These are not famous people whose names you would remember. You would remember today. The same is true in a slightly different way of the vast range of civic associations, particularly fraternal associations like the Masons or the Knights of Columbus, which see an explosion of participation in the later 19th century. And these are groups where you have to go and you do something with your fellow members to achieve something of common benefit. Maybe partly because you have a lofty sense of your social responsibility, but also because they provide real goods to their members. And all of this is eroded through the 20th century by a combination of regulatory factors. It becomes much harder for political parties to raise money and therefore harder for them to engage in these kinds of activities. That was a measure intended to fight corruption. Government services that you can enjoy as of right replace some of these formal networks of aid, so you don't need the party boss if you can collect Social Security. And also the quality of entertainment increases enormously. And this sounds silly, but I really think it's true. If you were bored in 1900, the only way to be less bored was to go somewhere that there were other people and talk to them. And that was very good for civic life. The advent of mass media, radio, television, and ultimately, of course, the internet today make that far less necessary, and you can entertain yourself at home.
And
And
you could be an
all
avatar and not even be a human, a real
you can be
person
an
online.
avatar and
Yeah.
engage in this virtual life. And all of these changes make civic and political activity much less appealing. And once again, these were not things that people learned in schools. They were not activities that they were able to theorize and express.
So
They
I'm going
knew
to
how
put
to do them because they did them. And we don't
so
do them anymore.
where were women in that picture? Because women didn't get the vote till what 1920 in the 19th Amendment. Was that structure exclusively for males, primarily white males?
No, to the contrary, women were the engine of associational life right down through the middle of the 20th century. And in his well known book, Bowling Alone, the political scientist Robert Putnam admits somewhat under duress because he doesn't want to say anything that will be too upsetting to his readers, that the entry of women into the mainstream of economic, political, and cultural life probably undermined civic life because there were all of these other things that women could be doing, and they ceased to rely on civic association and often political party work.
Even though
And
they even prior to getting the vote, you're saying they
even
had an
even
influence prior to
even
getting.
prior even prior to getting the vote, and through most of the 20th century when women could vote, um, they women found other outlets for their energy. On the whole, that's a good thing, but probably was not a good thing for civic participation.
Have you thought, I'm sure you've thought, but have you come to any conclusions about what to do in the 21st century about this, particularly given the rise of social media, and now we have pandemics where, isolation is really becoming its own epidemic by some standards. I'm, not an epidemiologist or a doctor, but I do have four children, and some in their teens, and there is a lot happening on their phones. And is there a way, short of civics? I understand civic education isn't something that you think is going to be a fix or a cause. Maybe you said it's not a cause. Maybe it's also not a fix. What needs to happen realistically? We of course can't go back to 1900. Some people would call that system corrupt, or of course now there are laws that preclude it. We can assess it, but what do we do now?
Well, I think, although of course we can't go back to 1900, we can take inspiration from the past. And one of the episodes, which I take as a message to us, revolves around a different social problem, which was alcohol abuse, which in the 19th century was a problem almost beyond our imagining. Take all the problems that people associate with drugs today. All of the same things were true, but the cause was alcohol rather than more complicated substances. And the temperance movement began in the early 19th century as a form of civic association, undertaken by men and women who saw a problem not just in their own lives, but in their society, and committed to fight it together. Yes, through legislation, although it was quite a long time before significant alcohol restrictions and ultimately prohibition were passed. But at first, through civic association, and that meant that they committed to each other to change their own lives to address the problem that they saw around them. Now, of course, the problem of social media is not the same as the problem of alcohol in the 19th century, but it does have some similarities in that it's a collective action problem. It's a problem of everyone doing what they want, which they think is okay for themselves, but leads to bad social outcomes. And if people were able to associate and work together to fight that problem 2 centuries ago, I see no reason that we couldn't today. So maybe what we need is a 21st century version of the temperance movement, and of people who say, I am not going to abuse social media. I will not permit my family to abuse social media. I will not associate with those who do abuse social media. And it may take decades or longer, but that is the only way really to change the character of a democratic society.
What about misinformation or, lies online that, and not, some of it's well-meaning that just gets passed around, some of it is planted, and of course we've heard recently reports of how Facebook knew their algorithms were spreading lots of lies during the 2020 election and didn't step in. Does that, in your mind, all of this false information or information that's fed into my phone just based on my click swipes, comments, because it listens to me, pings in my when I drive around the cell towers, um, is Does that make it harder, or do you still think that the temperance movement template can overcome misinformation without regulation?
I think there's certainly a place for regulation, although I am very skeptical of efforts that look to me like censorship, and that I think are often counterproductive. So I'm skeptical of the category of misinformation or disinformation, which often in practice turns out to be people saying things that I don't like and they shouldn't be allowed to say. And of course, there are examples of this that I myself regard as pernicious, but I don't think calls to purge certain ideas or certain claims from social media are going to be successful. Um, the purge never quite works. There are always ways around it. And the act of banning it only increases attention. So that kind of regulation doesn't seem very promising to me. I do think, though, that there is a place for regulation. The regulation perhaps should have a different form, treating social media as drugs, alcohol, and tobacco have been treated. That is to say, as an addictive substance that is bad for our brains, not because specific ideas or claims are broadcast and those can be removed, but because there's something bad about the medium itself.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been discussions recently about Instagram and in particular, and whether it's especially damaging to girls and young women. I don't know if that's true specifically, but I do think, and here the temperance movement is a relevant inspiration. We should regard social media itself as dangerous, rather than to assume that there's some safe use, and if they fix the algorithms, everything will be okay.
Or maybe there's somewhere in between, some combination. I don't know. It seems like some stuff, particularly, for example, the widespread child abuse, which some people call child pornography, that is just rampant and unregulated. Maybe it's not possible to regulate it, but we have things that I don't think we were paying attention to, that are quite damaging to people. But I want to ask you about January 6th. You mentioned earlier you don't think we're more polarized, and some would say the January 6th, something like that can happen with not so much views, but false information about a stolen election or that tons of ballots, things like that. Um, is that is that part of just American culture and history? Because to me, it seems that not understanding what is happening on January 6th, not understanding what an electoral college vote means, not understanding um, how elections are audited in your state. I could be wrong, but it seems like knowledge is power, and there's some pieces of just that system that are so misunderstood that people feel so wronged, based on things that aren't accurate, that it leads to violence. And I'm just interested in, because obviously you've thought a lot about this, how your views on, how to address this, if they've changed based on what happened on January 6th, or it's altered or affected.
No, they haven't really, and that's partly because, as you suggested, um, I think there is more of this in our history than we like to think. This is not a placid and orderly country, and never has been. In the 1850s, I believe, following the election of Franklin Pierce, or the inauguration of Franklin Pierce, there were riots in Washington, D.C., which led to the army reimposing order, and I believe something like a few dozen people were killed in that process. In 1932, before the election or before the inauguration of Franklin Roosevelt, an army of demonstrators. They were known as the Bonus Army. They were World War I veterans who wanted early payment of their pensions. Um, in response to the poverty caused by the Great Depression, camped out on the mall. There were about 43,000 of them. They were violently removed by tanks commanded by General MacArthur, later of World War II fame. So if you begin to look a little bit more closely in American history, I think the events of January 6th look less unprecedented, which is not by any means to excuse them. But it is to see them as less aberrant than some people seem to believe. And further, and we're still learning what happened. The gross incompetence of the law enforcement agencies that were active contributed a great deal in transforming what otherwise would have been a misguided but essentially orderly protest, which is certainly nothing new, into a national humiliation as it became. And if the law enforcement agencies had been more competent, it could very easily have gone the other way.
Or been there. That would have, I mean, I watched it and I was
Uh,
like, where are they? Having lived in
and
Washington, they weren't
further,
there.
you mentioned conspiracy theories about millions of votes being stolen or transferred or conjured up by the ghost of Hugo Chavez. Again, I think all of those things are false, but conspiracy theories are nothing new in American life either. So what January 6th suggests to me is that it was a kind of revelation of the seamy underside of American politics that has really always been there.
So you're not
It's
alarmed. Is that
easier
right?
to ignore. No, I am alarmed. But what was new in January 6th was not what happened out on the mall. What was new on January 6th was the direct encouragement provided by a sitting president. But that's not a problem of civic education.
Mm-hmm.
That's a problem of a grossly unfit person being elected.
Well, this is honestly the most optimistic conversation I've had in a very, very long time, because I don't have your historical knowledge, and it is deeply alarming. But one thing you mentioned in your piece, um, is that there's the civic education movement, or whatever we could call it, although well intentioned, seems to be about converting more, quote, college educated progressives, versus, quote, living with genuine disagreements. And I loved that second part. This idea of tolerating that someone might not agree with you. Is there anything in history, besides, or maybe it's the same thing, besides these civic education groups, the Masons, the political parties, etc., that that could be transferred to today? Um, I mean, and I'm a law professor, so I think about, okay, learning how to think in ways that tolerate disagreement, because you have to, or you'll get disbarred or lose your case, right? But do you have historic other examples from history that could maybe be brought to bear today, kind of like the temperance movement, around learning to tolerate disagreement and say, listen, we don't agree, but you're still okay with me. I mean, we can agree to disagree and be tolerant of the fact that often this stuff isn't black and white. There's just a lot of ambiguity and gray in a lot of these areas.
Unfortunately, that's a very difficult thing to do. But in this case, I do think educational changes would be useful. Institutions of higher education are very bad at this. They all say they're good at it. But it's clear that when they talk about tolerance and diversity, they mean embracing a very particular understanding of what those things mean, rather than permitting disagreement about it. And as you've probably seen in the papers, there's a current controversy at Yale Law School, essentially involving administrative pressure being placed on a student who made a bad and tasteless joke in a party invitation. And it was they made it very clear that the offense in this case was not the tasteless invitation, um, but public disagreement with their perception of what it means to be just and tolerant. So this is sort of a physician heal thyself situation. If educational institutions, and particularly institutions of higher education, want to have any credibility when they talk about civic education and how the rest of the country should live, they might start closer to home and demonstrate that they are capable of accommodating and even encouraging genuine disagreement and pluralism, rather than imposing a narrow and really quite partisan understanding of what inclusion and tolerance mean.
Well, and an understanding that is exclusionary and intolerant, and stifles speech, which then stifles thought, which, in my experience with students, then they don't engage because they're afraid of stepping on an eggshell or a landmine that they didn't mean to step in. And so I couldn't agree with that more either. I mean, and that tends to be more on the left end of the political spectrum. We're so intolerant of tolerance across the way. Do you think that's fear of being canceled on Twitter? I mean, why? And we also see these people that get canceled or get called out, um, making these obsequious apologies. And I'm just an awful human and I didn't realize that. Rather than, listen, my background is such that that's just how I thought in that moment, but it doesn't make me, condemned to, the depths of hell for eternity as a bad person. To me, it's that automatic conviction and sentence like that is the problem, rather than let's understand each other and maybe we can get to some place where we both learn something in this conversation.
Well, I couldn't speculate on the reasons that people behave as they do. I mean, one thing that we learn from the incident at Yale is that the administrations are providing them with prepared statements that they can then read or post, and that maybe explains why they all seem to sound exactly the same. I can only imagine that people want to save their jobs and they want these episodes to be over as quickly as possible, and they're willing to say what they think they have to say in order to do that. Um, but the consequence, as I've suggested, is that institutions of higher education have very little credibility in these matters. And as I suggested in the piece and some other things that I've written, college administrators are really the worst possible people to be teaching these lessons because they seem absolutely unable to accept genuine disagreement and civic, not controversy necessarily, but civic contact on their own campuses.
Interesting. What you're talking about was missing from American culture is also less likely to happen on college campuses. And I also think faculty don't know how to manage that conflict in the classroom. They don't want to deal with it, so they just it doesn't. Maybe some education of educators about how to foster tolerant civic education might be helpful as well.
I actually think, and I've written about this in other places, that faculty are not so much the problem. The problem more often lies with professional administrators who often, although not always, have very little experience of teaching or scholarship, and that was the case at Yale. So, yes, I'm sure that I and other professors could indeed learn to do better, but I think professors on the whole do a reasonably good job. I worry much more about what happens outside the classroom than what happens in it.
Yeah, we've all experienced some of that in the faculty world. Well, Professor Samuel Goldman, thank you so much. I've learned a lot. Appreciate your coming on civil politics and giving, I think, really fresh views on these very sobering, important topics. And so I've learned a lot. And thank you again for coming on.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.